Christian. I'm going to try and host today. We'll go straight into Adam's presentation and then we'll take some questions and answers and then Karenza. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you. So look, if I was asked to have done this talk like 10 or 15 years ago, it would have been really simple because I talked about it all the time. But I got to put my hands up. I honestly haven't thought about mephedrone other than with a few patients who I see within the chemsec scene, a couple of ADHD patients for a long time. So I had to go and look up some stuff and find some old slides. But I just want to take you back to like 2010 and just kind of think about what else was going on in the world. It was like, the Conservatives and Lib Dems had just been elected and then that didn't turn out very well, did it? There was like a huge bloody volcano in Iceland, which ruined flights. There was a lovely royal engagement. Austerity started. It's when the first iPad came out. Like, it's that long ago. It's also the year that Instagram was launched. So we're talking, I think, really quite a different time. And in deference to David not being here, it was also when David's MCD paper in Lancet came out comparing drug harms. And that really has become a staple of the drug conversation. So it's a long time ago. But I actually think that 2008, 9, 10 period really was a time when the world of drugs kind of had changed forever because it was kind of the boom of not just mephedrone, but a whole bunch of kind of people being able to access drugs on the internet, not just the open net, but also the dark net. And it was like the internet suddenly became this drug market without borders. It was nuts. But it also coincided with the rise of the Silk Road, darknet drug markets, Bitcoin. And so we started to see people buying drugs online. And then there were all these novel drugs coming out. But around the same time, the UK was having a bit of a crisis, not just having voted the Tories in, but they had really crap drugs. Like purity of coke was declining year on year. I mean, average kind of street purities were like 20, 25%. I mean, I was involved in a few court cases. There was one in Swansea where they'd kind of busted someone with 10 kilos of coke. And the purity of the coke they were knocking out on the streets of Swansea was 5%. So coke was really rubbish. People were not happy. And MGMA purity had plummeted as well because there'd been lots of emphasis on kind of stopping kind of saffron oil coming out. So drugs were really rubbish and there was a gap in the market. And it was a perfect storm. Internet access, rubbish drugs, people looking at old kind of research papers and going, ooh, that drug looks like it might be a bit stimulanty. And mephedrone comes along. So 4-methyl methcathinone, typical pretty much amphetamine. But before 2007, no one had ever really heard of it. It's a really similar structure to amphetamine, but also a little bit similar to cat, which is what chewed by people from Yemen and that part of the world. But you don't need raw plant material to produce it. And it was kind of lucky for me because we just restarted the Mixed Mag Drug Survey a year or two ago, and obviously tapping into clubbers and things, we were getting a sentinel drug using population. And I think in the second year when Global Drug Survey was relaunched after the Mixed Mag Survey, you just were seeing all of these adverts and head shops with people flogging plant food. And it was all just a bit kind of weird. However weird the marketing and media coverage in the UK was, in the US it was even weirder, even by like government agencies who were obsessed by calling drugs like mephedrone and other cathinones like bath salts. And they were writing medical papers on bath salts. And I just found that really bizarre, even kind of like the DEA, as opposed to synthetic cathinones, amphetamine-type novel stimulants. Really weird. They rapidly became big news for the media. New Kids on the Block, ministers told of legal high explosions, fears of new ecstasy on the street, and it gave some great headlines, including my favourite ever drug headline, which was Legal Drug Team ripped his scrotum off. And I can tell you, because I checked the story, that story is bollocks. That's my favourite drug joke. Over a 2 or 3 year period, myself and other people from Global Drug Survey wrote a lot of papers around mephedrone because it really disrupted the drugs market. GDS 2010, which was in 2009. So it would have run in November 2009. It would have looked back over that year. And at that point, it was still pretty much a mixed mag. In fact, it may have been last mixed mag drug survey. So it was clubbers. And so about 2,000 clubbers in the UK, 43% of them had used mephedrone in the last year. And it was the sixth most commonly used drug, and basically after cannabis, coke, MGMA, there was mephedrone. And that was just bizarre. A drug had come from nowhere to basically being the fourth most commonly used illicit drug. And really early on, it was like people liked it and they said it was better than coke. Now, part of the reason is that the coke they were probably comparing it to was a bit crap. And so we put out some very early work, and it was normally 10 quid a gram. If you bought it online or in bulk, you could get it down to about 5. But I think one of the things that was really attractive for people is that on the packet, it went 99.8% pure. And the very early honeymoon description was that mephedrone lasted about the same time or a bit longer than coke. The quality of high was as good or better. And they thought the risks were the same or maybe a little bit worse. So early on, there was this little sniff, pardon the pun, of, what, may not be that great. And so we carried on doing some papers, and I don't know why the animation here is off. But what it basically showed is that compared to cocaine and MDMA, mephedrone was kind of more pleasurable. Its effect strength was higher. Its negative effect profile was better. The only thing even early on that people were aware of is its urge to use was higher. And effectively, it was basically short-acting ecstasy, which is a really bad recipe for a drug to become really likable. It had a high abuse liability. Nice drug that makes you friendly, but it's a stimulant and people build up tolerance and they take more. But because the existing drug market was so rubbish, it really started dominating. And this was a little map that we did. And we asked people, what's the drug that you've used most recently for the first time? So this is in 2010. And it was mephedrone. It just became a dominant drug. And it looked pretty nice, lots of people rating kind of consistent feelings of euphoria, empathy, improved concentration, a bit of loss of appetite. And it looked pretty much like your archetypal stimulant. Made you a little bit horny. Higher doses, people were talking about getting restless, a bit panicky, anxious, but predominantly, quite positive. Most people were snorting it. It was not very nice snort. People spoke about a really horrible chemically smell and taste, which also came in people's sweat. But what was different to coke and kind of mephedrone was much more empathogenic. And people spoke about its incredible pro-social effects. And it made you horny, and so it was picked up by the chemsex scene. But people also spoke about the fact that when they were hanging out with people or sleeping with people who had done mephedrone, they basically smelled of cat's piss. But it was Moorish. Mephedrone's like Pringles. You don't want Pringles constantly, but once you've got one Pringle, you end up eating them all day. And it was this Moorishness and its cheapness that really led to problems, because it meant that there wasn't a financial restriction on people using. People would just carry on using and stay up. And because the more stimulants they were taking and the more monoamines they were depleting, the come down and crash was dreadful. And I'll come back to this in a little bit. The honeymoon didn't last very long for a drug that really only had a flutter for about 12 to 18 months. By the beginning of 2010, people started to worry. And it wasn't just the government that was worrying, it was users. So this was GDS a year later. And mephedrone was the drug that concerned people about their friends more than anything else. And I think worry among consumers about their friends is a really good marker for a drug causing problems. And we then did a follow-up study looking at the risks of dependence. And basically, it was 30% of people who had used mephedrone in the last year met DSM criteria for dependence, which is really, really high. Although I don't think that would have been enough to tip the balance for government legislation, it certainly left the treatment organizations going, we're not very good at treating stimulant use. We don't want another cheap Moorish stimulant that people get dependent on. I guess one of the other things that we were interested in was trying to look at its risk and effect profile compared to MDMA and coke. And what you can basically see is agitation, cardiac effects like chest pain, memory loss, and being paranoid. Mephedrone was much worse than MDMA and coke, and consumers do not want to take a drug that makes them feel crap. But I think the one that really got people thinking was the fact that the come down was so brutal. And that was impacting on people's social interactions and their ability to study. It probably also explained why we started to get a case series of people who were reporting taking their lives by suicide after mephedrone, because the come down was so bad. And certainly in people with pre-existing depression, this was going to be a really bad drug. And people started to turn up to the emergency department. I mean, these rates were pretty similar for, in fact, actually at the time, these were much higher than for MDMA and coke because the drugs were so crap. So I've got a feeling that after synthetic cannabinoids, mephedrone was like number 2 or 3 in terms of the drug that led people into the emergency department. Again, more likely to turn up if you use a lot and you're mixing with alcohol. And there were more and more case reports about how people were presenting. And it's all the stuff you'd expect with amphetamine type drugs. Chest pain, hypothermia, agitation, aggression, violence, few cases of kind of SIADH, and people becoming agitated, paranoid, briefly psychotic, all predictable dose-related stimulant effects. But the thing that ultimately led to its demise was reports of people dying. In fact, interestingly, the reports of the 2 lads up north, 18 and 19, who had, it was said early on they had died as a result of taking mephedrone. In fact, actually hadn't taken mephedrone. But by that point, I think there was such pressure on the government to do something. There was really very little choice other than to ban it. So what happens when a government bans a drug? Well, initially, not very much, actually, because it was still pretty easy to get online. It was still available, and it was still really likable by clubbers. And of course, the Chinese government, who most of the mephedrone was coming out from China at the time, just continued to produce it. I mean, there was a dip among clubbers the following year, but it actually took 2 years for mephedrone-related deaths to decline. We did a quick follow-up, and although it was continuing to be used, of course, what had happened now it was banned is that the price had just gone up. And it was very quickly replaced by a bunch of other cathinones with other random names. And this process just continued for the next 3 or 4 years until the government just went, oh, this is too hard playing cat and mouse. We'll just bring in the psychoactive X ban. This is why mephedrone was such a seminal drug. Is it still being used? I mean, yes, but the only groups I come across now who use it are predominantly within the chemsex scene, where it's cheaper than coke, it's still functional, doesn't last as long as crystal meth, but it still has value. There are increasing seizures in places like India. I think this could potentially have a resurgence because I think it remains attractive. I still don't know why it never became really attractive outside the UK. It should have had an effect profile that was good enough. I think there are outbreaks of IV use in countries such as Romania, where there are outbreaks of HIV and things, and there's recently been huge seizures in India. So there must be a market somewhere. There was a transition from people just snorting to injecting, even early on in places like Barnsley and areas of Swansea and Dublin. And it was incredibly toxic, and people were getting necrosing fasciitis and things. I think it was a lesson. I think it was a lesson because it meant that we have to start thinking around generic harm reduction strategies when a new drug comes on board. Like, people learn how to take drugs safely from their friends who have used that drug before. The drug comes along and you don't know how long it lasts, how long it takes to come on. You need some generic advice. And so there's a nice little animated video by Mike Linnell on the Global Drug Survey YouTube channel about advice on taking a new drug for the first time. And I obviously just have to quickly mention the Staying Safe program. But anyway, Staying Safe program is available for universities and covers lots of things, but also sexual assault, consent, police your rights, as well as lots of drugs. I will stop there.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much, all. Thank you very much, Chris, for jumping in to introduce, and absolutely fantastic, Adam. So, without further ado, I will invite now Karenza. So, welcome, Karenza. Thank you very much for joining us again.
Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me. This was a blast from the past. So we were kind of like going down memory lane, and I actually kind of wanted to concentrate on how Mephedrone emerged, but perhaps also some of the lessons that we may or may not have learned from its emergence. The first thing I wanted to say was also, and I see Fiona's on the call, that this was a real exciting time to be doing drugs research. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of process of producing some of the data about Mephedrone, because I think there is a kind of interesting story to be told about how do we find out about emergent drug trends, what kind of work do we need to do. Adam's talked again about harm reduction in the face of kind of a substance that we didn't know much about at the time, although it kind of become quite clear what was going on quite rapidly. So yeah, so a really interesting time. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about why I think actually certain kinds of research, in situ, online surveys, which obviously the Global Drug Survey is kind of one of the best known examples. Kind of two groups of early adopters, which I'll say something about briefly, and also what kind of happened after, I suppose, the ban when Mephedrone was brought into the Misuse of Drugs Act. I thought these two kind of representations or headlines from Vice were interesting. So remembering the great Mephedrone craze, which I guess is sort of what we're doing here as well. But then, as Adams said about how, you know, these kind of stimulants, cheap stimulants, will always sort of find a home, often related to the kind of material, structural, social conditions that people find themselves in. And so there's some interesting kind of concentration on other groups in other countries, particularly young people, but also people injecting Mephedrone. So it's an interesting story of how, you know, how we got to where we are now with the substance. In situ research at raves, I mean, one of the things that came out of how we kind of ended up thinking and finding out about Mephedrone was just noticing what was going on when we were undertaking research surveys, for example, actually at dance music events. And as Adam said about the mixed bag survey, clubbers were a particular kind of group that are often, as with ketamine as well, at the forefront of these kind of trends. So information about ravers and clubbers was particularly important in kind of telling this story. And of course, this has got in situ research at raves, has got a much longer history in a sense, right back to the early days of rave culture and the emergence of the use of MDMA at raves. And so I found this research reports from the rave by Russell Newcomb, and you know, kind of this idea of finding out what's going on by actually going to the spaces where these substances were being taken. So you know, that's helpful. I think sometimes there's harder to access settings in which at the time Mephedrone was being used. And I remember doing with Fiona some surveys down in Vauxhall, South London, in the gay scene, gay clubs down there. And there was a sauna on, I don't know if it's Vauxhall High Street. We would really like to have gone in there and find out about, you know, the more domestic hidden spaces of Mephedrone use. And I think that's sort of become important as well. And then obviously nowadays to find out about these kind of emergent trends, we have huge online targeted population surveys, such as Adam's Global Drug Survey. And so that kind of gives us a lot more of a kind of window into these kind of trends. So, as I said, I really remember there being a lot of talk about how awful purity was of the kind of two main drugs that clubbers took. And I think one of the other things that happened was that benzodiazepines started to dominate the market. There was a lot of reports amongst users of headaches, for example, from those substances which were missold as ecstasy. And so, the emergence of Mephedrone relates very specifically as well to the illegal drug market at the time, which was, we're quite used to high purity, very strong MDMA ecstasy tablets now, but at the time they were being sold for as little as £1 because of their lack of purity, basically. So Mephedrone, I suppose, emerged as a cheap alternative. And I was looking back at some of the work we wrote about it, particularly in relation to the spaces where you could buy it. So obviously it was this kind of online drug, but it was also a sort of high street drug as well, where head shops are selling it. Head shop seems like very old fashioned now, but they were a thing. And then also obviously from people's usual dealers as well. And initially it was kind of touted as having similar effects to MDMA, ecstasy and cocaine. And as Adam said, this kind of, interesting mixture of those effects. But then there was also some pushback, particularly amongst older and more experienced drug users who had used MDMA maybe in the early days, who said, well, no, it's not the same. It's not like that at all. So thinking about why it emerged, at least amongst clubbers, there was this thing about how more popular illegal traditional drugs, there was poor availability, and in comparison, Mephedrone's purity was attractive. Legality to a certain extent, although that was more around the legality, how it enabled ease of access, and also obviously dealers selling it as a legal high, very cheap, and the high in particular was sought after at the time. So drugs that work, there's loads of quotes I could have shared with you guys, but drugs that work, or there's drugs in drugs. I had a white powder, I think it was a drug. It was a very kind of interesting time, and as Mephedrone emerged, users were kind of happy that there were substances that had an effect that they were seeking, I guess. So down to London, South London, some of the gay clubs down there. I think it's kind of interesting how much the scene has changed in that particular location, which I'll say more about in a second. But this was, again, in situ surveys, going to the spaces where people were taking these substances and trying to work out what was going on. So one of the big kind of discussions at the time was about, is Mephedrone a drug of initiation? Is there a certain kind of age of onset, for example? And people, new drug users being caught up in the Mephedrone craze, and or particularly amongst more established club drugs, was it being used to supplement them, or was it replacing them? So there's this kind of big debate about how did Mephedrone fit in with the wider picture. And what we found was that Mephedrone, at least amongst this group, was being added to existing drug repertoires. So instead of replacing ecstasy and cocaine, there was a kind of additive effect. I think this is really interesting. If you think of where we are now in terms of polydrug use, we know that the number of substances, particularly in relation to drug-related deaths, that are found in people's systems have kind of been going up and up. Again, if you think about the emergence of pink cocaine, the kind of rather random mix of MDMA, cocaine and ketamine, this is kind of interesting to think about polydrug use and how Mephedrone had a place in that as well. So that was the early adopters. We had clubbers, gay clubs or gay dance clubs. Then we had the ban, and in, I think it's April 2010, Mephedrone was brought under the Misuse of Drugs Act. And obviously this kind of predates the later Psychoactive Substances Act in 2016. So there was a whole kind of, again, a big debate about how we're going to control this substance. At that point, we were interested in, well, what happens? What it is, have we seen, or are we going to see the emergence of what were then called second generation legal highs? And I saw in the chat, there's quite a lot of talk about, all these different substances that were then, or have now emerged as well. And so again, from in situ surveys in very small or relatively small town nighttime economies in the northwest of England, we had some great researchers go out and, ask people on a normal night out what they were taking. And at the time, circa kind of 2010, there was talk about bubble and a great deal of confusion, I think, about bubble as a nickname, or was it another NPS? And I think what really came out of that was a certain kind of indiscriminate use of stimulants. And in fact, that's one of the kind of phrases that we used at the time. And I suppose this kind of points to, it was concerning, but it points to this idea that there's a kind of enduring market for cheap highs. And, we've seen this to a certain extent with ketamine, obviously a different type of substance, but the impact of pricing, particularly in kind of these austere times, is very, very important. The crash, 2008 crash, preceded what we're talking about here. So that also all kind of makes sense. As Adam said, I mean, the representations of Mephedrone were really interesting. And I think there was this interesting kind of discussion about how, there was a moral panic. Was there a moral panic about Mephedrone? If you think about some of the headlines, you could say, yes, there was a moral panic. There was a lot of sensationalism. There was probably, over-reporting potentially. But one of the other issues with this was that there was a kind of quite simplistic use of this idea of a moral panic by some more liberal commentators, particularly in the broadsheets at the time, that kind of had already invested quite a lot in Mephedrone as a sort of replacement for a potential replacement for MDMA in particular. And there was a lot of talk about the ecstasy high of Mephedrone. So there was a kind of investment to a certain extent. And that was then used to argue against criminalisation. Now, I think a lot of you know about my opinions about prohibition and criminalisation, but I think what was interesting at the time when engaging with the kind of commentators about this issue, that they were ignoring to a certain extent a lot of concern, as Adam said, when it started to emerge about how some of the very real issues around come down, around depression, around the negative impacts of what is basically an amphetamine were ignored by the commentators. So a real wide range of representations of Mephedrone, but not necessarily related to what we might call a moral panic. What were the lessons learned? I think, to a certain extent, we did have prohibition to blame for the emergence of NPS. Around the time that Mephedrone emerged, we know that MDMA production and distribution was compromised. And to a certain extent, the prohibition of certain substances that we knew a lot about, and I remember this at the time, people were saying, well, at least we know with MDMA what some of the harm reduction messages can be. We're used to it as a substance, whereas with Mephedrone and other NPS, a lot of harm reductionists, a lot of people in drug services, they were flying blind, really. And as time went on, we learned more about the substance and it became a bit easier. But that was one of the concerns, that this is an unknown chemical in a sense, and we didn't know what the impact would be or how to deal with it. The response, as you know, was, criminalisation, prohibition, and there was a kind of an ongoing debate, I guess, about whether or not this was the best way to deal with the emergence of this substance. So post-ban was an interesting period as well. I think it was an interesting way to think about what happens when you ban a substance. What is it? Is it there? Does it then just go away? Or is it replaced, as we thought it might be, by other kinds of NPS? To a certain extent, that did happen. And the second generation of NPS is a complete mess. Various different, as I said, unidentified white powders being taken. And then, of course, eventually we ended up with, at least in the UK, the Psychiatrist Substances Act in 2014. We saw a kind of return in the post-ban period, but also related to better purity of MDMA and coke that emerged. And I guess by then, a couple of years after the ban on Mephedrone, people had returned to what we might call more traditional substances. And I think this is a kind of example, I guess, this return, a criticism of what I would say is a failed prohibitionist response. You've seen this with ketamine, with it going from sort of CB, potentially up to a class A now as well. So a really messy time after the Mephedrone ban. There was a kind of really real mess about what was going to happen, but now we know what happened. It was a return to more traditional substances. And then just to end, thinking about where we are now. So I've just spoken to a student that's working with me on a project about ketamine, and she mentioned she's a harm reductionist lead for a club in a city in the north, and she's talking about how mephedrone. I just assumed that she would never have heard of it. She said, "Oh yeah, it's been used by some students, maybe only in the last 6 to 12 months." And it's so I think again, mephedrone. It started off pretty niche amongst clubbers and ravers and on the gay scene, exploded to a certain extent. I think maybe again we're seeing something quite similar with ketamine having gone from something quite niche and a sort of subculture almost to then moving into much wider range of spaces. Mephedrone is still used within the chemsex scene. Jamie Hakam, who's written some really great stuff about chemsex, talked about mephedrone as being one of the 3 or 4 drugs that are used in that scene. So again, that's interesting. And I think just to kind of end, particularly in relation to stimulants, we can think about how they emerge, often related to the kind of material, the social, or the economic conditions that people are experiencing at the time. And I think to a certain extent, that's one of the reasons that mephedrone emerged in the way that it did as well. Okay, thanks, guys.
So yeah, thank you very much, Karenza. Yeah, really interesting, really good stuff. We got a really, really vibrant chat. Other stuff I'd like to be interested to see people's views in the chat. So, I asked further evidence of a resurgence there, and Fiona Measham said yes in the annual English Festival survey. Also testing by the loop, partly related to post-COVID brief decline in MDMA. So perhaps that's, as it seems mephedrone first burst onto the scene relating to an MDMA shortage, there might have been some repetition there. Josh Torrance is definitely back. It was always popular in chemsex scenes, but due to market trends, it's regained some niche popularity. Ren Massetti, yes, a number of messaging app suppliers offer MCAT, so maybe an interesting hand in hand with kind of growing Telegram, and that might relate. But anyway, so now we'll move on to more Q's and A's. So, question from Matt Southwell. So, do you think we would have had the surge in mephedrone if cocaine and MDMA purity quality had not plummeted?
I think the answer is yes. Would it have had such a foothold and an opportunity if what else had been available hadn't been so crap? No, but the reality is it was always going to be able to undercut in terms of price those other 2 drugs. And I think what the synthetic cannabinoids have told us is that there is a marginalized, vulnerable, disadvantaged population who, at the end of the day, will use the cheapest bang for buck. Unfortunately, both mephedrone and the synthetic cannabinoids are both drugs you build tolerance up to really quickly. And so as drugs of dependence, even among people who are without large incomes, they can drive significant dependence problems. So yeah, I think it would have come, but I guess the other bit is, Matt, it arrived just at the time where there was a boom in online commoditization of just about everything, and the whole idea that you could kind of stroll through research papers and find different drugs that had various different effects meant there was a great opportunity. And then combine that with buying things on darknet with untraceable Bitcoin, that's hugely attractive. And then it was someone being smart enough to look at the scheduling of drugs in the UK, going, I can whack a fluoride atom on the end of this and it's legal. Yeah, so I think it just got there first. It would have made an impact because its honeymoon effect was just too good.
Thank you very much. And before I pass it over to Karenza, I'll just quickly follow up on a couple of things you said there. So once on the cheapness, I don't know if anyone missed or saw Dr. Z posting in the chat that the first ever half-ton consignment of mephedrone cost $28, which even by the cheap standards of initial consumer prices is quite striking. Also, you mentioned there about dependent injection use, and I think both you and Karenza's presentations briefly alluded to that. And in fact, in a very recent research interview I did just this October, an interview participant was telling me about his experiences as a Mephedrone injector. Did sound at the time it was really quite common and big issue. And also told me a story which is very much dependent injection use combined with chemsex, which I'll repeat since it's a very funny story that he told me of a time that he intended to meet someone else where they're both going to inject Mephedrone for the purposes of sex. But sadly for him, the sex didn't quite happen. So he injected his whole gram of Mephedrone. And then it turned out what actually happened was he woke up on his bed, covered in his own semen, surrounded by paramedics, since he'd spontaneously ejaculated and then had a massive seizure. And he was also on license, so he was quickly arrested when he was taken out of hospital. And that didn't end as he intended to. So anyway, a quick note on, as well as the kind of club drugging, the recreational side, some of the dependent side as well. But no, sorry, to go back to Karenza, I don't know if you have anything to say on perhaps the inevitability of Mephedrone.
I was hoping you said something to say on the story you've just told, James.
Well, you can follow up on that as well. If you've got anything on both of those things.
So I was just thinking a couple of things. I think it's kind of interesting. I remember drug treatment services where people working in services and were saying, God, we wish that people would go back to drugs that we're much more familiar with. I think it's kind of interesting if we're seeing similar shortages of heroin as other substances emerging being used by injecting drug users. So it was an interesting time. I think I agree with Adam about how it would have emerged, but maybe if there hadn't been the perfect storm, it wouldn't have taken over in quite the way that it did. And we were chatting before we came on the call about how, in a way, it was surprising that it didn't happen in other markets. For example, in Australia, where a good supplies of good quality MDMA and cocaine can be difficult to get hold of. So I think there was an inevitability because a lot of these kind of relate also to the social and economic conditions that people find themselves in. One of the things I did think as soon as we stopped talking about Mephedrone was the 2008 crash as well. And then obviously the austerity that we've seen in the last 15 years. So none of this is a surprise because of the relationship between various different forms of drug use and economic environment. And I think there was also, there was a lot of coverage about it. There was a lot of publicity in a sense about it. And that, as we know with what happened with MDMA, as soon as tabloid press get hold of things, there is an element of which they act as a great advert for these substances as well. So I think there was that going on at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Karenza. A couple of other follow-ups as well. So there's this very much theme of unintended consequences. Matt J posted a news article about what possibly kicked off the MDMA shortage, a massive bust of precursors. And of course, the irony, not only did that kick off all sorts of novel psychoactive use and resurgence, which has perhaps been up and down since then. Of course, eventually new precursors for MDMA were found, and that explains why we have the incredibly strong super pills and very cheap MDMA that last until today. So the authorities try to shut off one end of what they see as a problem and then create a whole new load of stuff, which is even harder to get back into the lamp. I was going to say something else as well, but I've forgotten. So I've got another question I will chuck back to Adam and Karenza and say that is, since the NPS Act, why do we still see many spice derivatives? Well, there's not the same market for stimulants. And very briefly, I'll say to that as well, interestingly, so the research I was doing last October, November, where I heard that Mephedrone and semen story, it was primarily interested in heroin and health. And this was in South Wales, and very few people were still using heroin when they were saying as well, because it's not very good. What I was hearing over and over and over was crack, alcohol, benzodiazepines, and pregabalin. Interestingly, in another location in the Midlands, I was asking similar questions, and I was hearing a lot about spice still being around. So interesting regional aspect to it. But so back since perhaps to Karenza and then to Adam. Yeah, anything on the current scene regarding spice? And perhaps interesting how that perhaps stuck around, that showed more market resilience than Mephedrone did.
I think it's around that migration to homeless, vulnerable population. So I might spend a lot of my time in prison, and spice still remains the biggest acute risk. And I'm now starting to see people who would typically only use it when they're in because they're bored and it helps pass time and deal with a bit of trauma. But when they're now leaving to the community, there are concerns over, risky heroin and shitty heroin. Spice, or synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, whether it's generation 2, 3, 4. And actually, oddly, China, who was the major production sites for most of the novel SCRAs, in 2003 passed laws that basically shut down precursor production and availability. So a lot of the synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonist productions moved over to India, and they're knocking out generation 2 and 3, which is slight, kind of a little bit more old school. I think potentially maybe not so dangerous. But the versatility and ability of synthetic cannabinoids to just about sort you out from any other problem you've got is quite remarkable. So for opiate users I'll work with, if you're clucky and you want something, obviously heroin's nice. You can't get hold of heroin, another kind of opiate, methadone or something will be fine. Pregab's lovely. Like pregab's the drug of choice for just sorting out any sort of drug problem, emotional trauma or distress. Can't get hold of that. Street benzos, but they're a little bit dodgy. But if you can't get any of that, you know what? Spice will just about sort you out. And there's also a lot of money still to be made from that population. You're getting in a kilo of various synthetic cannabinoids for, £3,000-4,000. Depending on potency, you are making a huge turnover. And, to give you an idea, in prison, depending on the time of year, a thumb-sized bit of paper dissolved in synthetic cannabinoids will cost you a £5. A credit card size will cost you 20 quid. Last Christmas, A4 sheets were going in prison from anywhere from 150 to 350 quid. The amount of raw product you would need to produce that A4 sheet doused in liquid is pennies. And so while there is a significant profit to be made from a drug that puts you in a place of oblivion, when you are stuck in an environment where oblivion is preferable to the reality of your existence in prison, that's why it's done around.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And I was to add to that, I was also doing some semi-recent research in a prison. It wasn't about drugs, but I did end up asking about drugs. I was told stories of how the spice prison culture has developed, which I hadn't realised. So I learned then about it being doused onto paper, which part of making it very convenient to measure and sell. And I was told about, economies where the credit cards, the bit you said were for £5, as also someone cleaning your cell was apparently the going rate for that. So it really is a kind of established prison currency. And what you said about the small amount of liquid, which costs pennies to make, which can then turn into an A4 piece of paper's worth, really strikes me that must be so easy to smuggle. And to get that genie back in the lamp of it's so rampant in prison, the smuggling is so established, it's such a small thing, which must be so easy to smuggle. I mean, how on earth this has stopped from continuing to be widespread in prisons, I just don't know at all.
Give people something else to do in prisons.
Yeah.
And I had someone on Wednesday who came in and saw me, pissed off and angry. He'd used spice a couple of times since he'd been in, had come off his methadone, and he was fuming. He'd been in prison for 4 weeks. He said, no one's come to see me. All I want is NACA. I want a job. I want something to stop me getting bored shitless here, because when I'm bored, I'm going to use drugs. And he was fuming. And I turned around and went, how absolutely justified you are to feel so pissed off that you are being given nothing to occupy yourself, but you're smart enough to come to me. Why he's coming to me, I have no idea, but it's like to go, can you get me something to do so I'm not bored? So I went off and spoke to the various people. But you know what? You have to offer something else for people to pass their time. If not, you know what? Sleeping is the best way to get through a long prison sentence. It should be better than that. It is shit.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. It's a result.
Sorry, I say that as an individual and not on behalf of any of the organisations, blah, blah, I work for, blah, blah, yeah.
Agreed, but yeah, I'll also add, it's a result of multiple failures. And there's another interesting unintended consequences. There was a time when Hash was the prison drug, but that seemed to go out with random urine testing. Then heroin, then spice, and again and get these genies back in the bottle, especially when it points to multiple other failures in the prison system. But yeah, moving back then to another question. This was also directed at you, Adam, but so Adam, you mentioned you don't really deal with Mephedrone currently, except in the case of ADHD. What is your experience in that?
I mean, I just think it's the same that you sometimes get people coming through, particularly students who will have kind of found that either, occasionally crystal meth or mephedrone has been a short-term fix for not their ADHD, because one of the things that can help you, or a clue that someone may have ADHD, is a paradoxical response to stimulants. So instead of feeling kind of, scattered and agitated and talking 100 miles an hour, sometimes people on stimulants, particularly if they're not mixing it with alcohol or other drugs, will say, actually, I can sit down, I'm quiet, I can listen to people, I'm not running around. And, my worry was that last year there was a bit of a global shortage of Elvance, which is one of the ADHD meds, and there's still a shortage of methylphenidate. And I know that on the darknet there were people sourcing either black market versions of those or other sorts of stimulants to get them through. And I think a drug like mephedrone or maybe methylone, the longer acting version, would have been a substitute. The only other place I kind of will still see it is among people within kind of chemsex, where I think it still has a pro-social, aphrodisiac kind of role along GHB and crystal. But I don't think it works well in the chemsex scene, because you've got to redose too quickly. And that's why crystal's fairly convenient, because you don't have to redose that often. But with GHB, you probably are dosing every couple of hours. So another drug you have to dose frequently is just not great. And I also think it would be another risk factor for people becoming psychotic within taking mephedrone on top of crystal.
Adam, thank you. I don't know, Karenza, if you have anything else on the ADHD point to add?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting point. I know that during the pandemic, when people have struggling to get hold of ADHD medications, that there was some sourcing on illegal markets of amphetamine. So I'm not sure if that was just speed, or if there was other amphetamine type substances, at least. And I think there's also been some evidence around people with ADHD being unable to access services and a diagnosis. We've just had West Street Health Secretary talking about overdiagnosis. I think there's a kind of real pressure on services for people with autism and ADHD more generally in the UK. So that is going on, and I've had several reports about people sourcing on the illegal market because they can't get their ADHD meds, or they are self-managing. I think that's an important issue.
Thank you very much. I've got another question. I'll probably keep this with Karenza. So from CNWL Club Drug Clinic, how do you think the more recent global changes in production and distribution of methamphetamine and other small lab production might impact further drug trends? Will price availability still dictate, or might market demands for customers utilise the more varied production networks to influence what's available? Quick thing I'll add is I always find it very interesting that methamphetamine has never really taken off in the United Kingdom. Of course it's there, but one explanation is cheap speed, which we've always had. But then you could say, okay, why did mephedrone come in so much when seemingly crystal meth never has? I've never seen a 100% convincing answer why we've never had massive popularity, and I don't know. But anyway, Karenza, if you want to have a bite at the Club Drug Clinic's question there.
Yeah, no, so that's interesting. We know globally amphetamine type substances have for a very long time been very popular. So I think, in terms of price and availability, but it is a mystery about methamphetamine. We were talking before about Australia, and I know the club scene in Australia, there's still quite high use of methamphetamine and amphetamine. So it is a mystery about why mephedrone hasn't exploded in the same way. So.
I think Mephedrone has broadened out its market hugely. 10 years ago, it was chemsex, it was 200 quid a gram, it was difficult to come across. I mean, club drugs put there, I mean, I see lots of people in prisons, and yeah, you can get a gram, for about 40 quid. That's cheap. The bit that's changed, though, is that I've seen like 4 or 5 people over the last 3 or 4 months who have come in reporting using crystal. And it's like, well, that's a bit odd. Blah, blah, blah. Are you gay, bisexual, chemsexy? No. Really? I'm apparently becoming the drug of choice within squats because it's cheap. And you know what? I mean, 40 quid for a gram of crystal versus, 60 quid for a gram of economy Coke. I mean, crystals are far better bang for buck. And I think historically we never saw it because I don't think it was encouraged by those people who dominated the coke market and the crack market. I imagine there are many Albanian gangs who would be very keen to keep out a good crystal meth market. But when you would also talk to crack cocaine users who had used crystal, what they said is they didn't like it because it wasn't as easy to control. Bizarrely, it's the short-acting nature of crack that bankrupts you, and that's why dealers hook you in with heroin because you wake up a bit clucky and you have to go and see them, but you make more money off crack. But crystal was too difficult to control, and honestly, if I had to, I worked in Australia for 10 years, and crystal's a real bloody problem because people go psychotic, and they're really aggressive and violent, and that's far less of a problem with crack. Shorter acting potent drugs are a bit of a mare. Longer acting potent drugs, still a bit of a mare, bit of a best. I think you'll see more crystal coming because it's cheap and it's long acting and you can smoke it, snort it and take it orally and inject it. Super versatile.
Adam, for that. An interesting point that Judith Yates made in the chat there about, Mephedrone more popular because it's shorter acting. You can certainly see that. One thing I would say is that crystal meth is a Friday night drug, not a Saturday night drug, if you want to have had at least some sleep by the time you're supposed to go to work on Monday. But I guess the interesting thing is, I said it, Australia, America, it did seem that it really was, much bigger there. And tell you why. It still interests me why we never had it so much. Although interesting to see if your prophecy will be correct, Adam, that it is coming and growing.
Well, but even purity of amphetamine powder in the UK has gone up a lot as well. So it used to be 4 or 5%, but actually better quality amphetamine sulfate's coming over at 30 or 40. And I don't know how many people blind tasting would really know the difference between 30%, 40% kind of amphetamine powder versus coke, to be honest, if you whacked a bit of lignocaine in it. To Emily's point about the labs, you don't need a lot of space. You can make crystal meth in a one-pot shop. You can also have everything you need in a mobile van, kind of like set up in the back of your car. So again, there are multiple routes of production, multiple precursors. The most popular of which historically in Australia used to be pseudoephedrine. But if any of you ever go off to Australia and you go into a chemist, you'll be up. In fact, you can't get it. But if you stopped off at more than one pharmacy on a stretch of motorway between New South Wales and Queensland, basically you'd be flagged and your details would be sent to the police because all the biker gangs would basically go into all the pharmacies, buy all the pseudoephedrine, and that's what they would use as their precursor. So I think you can still get pseudoephedrine in the UK. So that's everyone's favorite, easiest precursor for crystal meth, but there are many others.
Noted. Thank you very much. I've got another question here from Celine Vance, who said that we found here in Belfast, Northern Ireland, that when heroin dried out during COVID, people started injecting cocaine. This unfortunately led to lots of blood clotting, limbs needing amputated, etc. Have you found this to be an issue anywhere else, or is it very localized? I don't know if this is Karenza or Adam, either of you have heard of much of this, or anyone else can put what they've heard of into the chat.
It happened in Australia about 20 years ago when there was a heroin shortage and people started injecting amphetamines and coke. And it was completely counterintuitive that you would switch kind of a primary depressant for an upper. The one bit that is a bit weird, but opiate withdrawal is due to a noradrenergic storm. It's an outpouring of noradrenaline in your brain, and that's what makes you feel sick and sweaty and yawny and all of those dreadful things. Interestingly, if you're a really heavy stimulant user, you are always depleting your brain of monoamines. So bizarrely, heavy stimulant users can sometimes have less of a cluck. And I've also had some punters who have said to me, you know what, if you really cane it on crack after you've run out of heroin, you just wipe your body out. You just kind of can get through it. So yeah, that substitution for an entirely different drug has been seen in other areas.
Yeah, and I'd say that's very interesting what you said there, since I remember interviews for my PhD study, someone saying, yeah, sometimes to do a cluck, I just speed through it. He'd say just that was his thing. Like, if I'm going to cluck, I'll just be up for 4 days on speed, and then I'll come out the other end and I won't be clucking anymore, which was pretty interesting. Yeah, lots of interesting stuff. I can't remember the authors right now. Loads written about the 2000 heroin drought, since it really did disappear for a month and come back literally double the price. And many questions of what happens in a drug shortage can work, well, I guess, were to some extent answered in that natural experiment. I don't know if Adam or Karenza, there's anything else you'd like to follow up, or you've been just burning to kind of say and put out there.
No, it's just fascinating to kind of like switch your brain back 15 years ago and kind of think how many potential lessons we could have learned, how many of the things that we could have predicted would have happened did happen, and nothing was really put in place from either a service delivery or policy perspective to really change it. But I mean, you know, that's just, you could have chosen COVID or anything else. So our ability to learn from our lessons is amazingly disappointing.
I think that's one of the things that when going back over our research and looking at the trends and what happened with the whole narrative of the criminalisation and the PSA, and it's that history repeating itself. You know, you do feel like a bit of a doom spiral when it comes to responses. But then one of the things I have been thinking in relation to the responses to ketamine, there does seem to be a little bit more of an understanding of how much we need to bring in user experiences, really get users to inform what we're doing. And I think that's something that's maybe different from what it was before. But yeah, we're going round on the prohibition carousel, aren't we?
Yeah, thank you. We've actually got another couple more questions. So yeah, it's an interesting one. Is it a good thing or a bad thing that we've lost the head shops? Since really, you know, we had, when I was young, it was bongs, skins and salvia. And then it became, you know, lots more things, novel psychoactives, nitrous. You had that brief time at festivals when the head shop vans were dispensing nitrous balloons. And then they're all gone. Are they essentially a danger who are just chucking out untested drugs on anyone who'd show them a fake ID, or were they potential sites for harm reduction information being passed around? What do you reckon, Karenza and Adam?
I agree about the head shops, and that's partly related to my opinions about having legally regulated markets. So if you think about some of the mock-up shops around MDMA in Netherlands, you know, the idea of different types of shops that you could walk in and purchase your MDMA. So yeah, I think the head shops, it was a bit of a sad demise. I have no idea if they still exist. I don't know of any in Manchester. So I agree, yes, I would. It was a shame to see them go. Although I don't miss the tie-dye and the slightly strange smelling things that used to be sold. Dr. Herman's, that was it. I was trying to remember the one in Manchester.
I went to some head shops, like particularly down in Brighton, and they were unbelievably on the ball, helpful, educational, giving really good information. You know, so when, you know, this was like when Spice and was about, said, "Oh, I'd like to buy this," and they looked at me and they went, "Do you know anything about this?" And I went, "No." And I said, "And how would I use it?" And they were really good advice. You go up to Camden Town at the same time, obviously giving you complete nonsense. It was the same when mushrooms were legal. You know, there were places that would sell shrooms that would sit there and look at you and go, have you ever done this before? What sort of effect do you want? And would give you advice. And then there were other people that was just like, yeah, have whatever you want. So the idea of having regulated kind of shops are really important, but then you want to make sure that people who are giving that information are able to provide the right advice. And of course, the head shops had a bit of a problem because they probably didn't know what they were flogging. So I don't think they were necessarily a bad thing. And they could, as Karenza says, be, you know, a shadow of positive things to come in the future. It's like going to a good cocktail bar and someone giving you some advice on how to enjoy this legally regulated drug that kills 13,000 people a year. But never mind.
And I think it must have been an interesting, very difficult time for the head shop owners, people who might have been quite, principled psychonauts who were simply trying to turn a profit while selling drugs that they believed in, giving out information. And then suddenly the real money is in these unknown chemicals, which are very popular and flying off the shelves. And anyway, another question is a more specific one. How is ketamine different in terms of impact on Cluck Cliff on CDC Zoom? I don't understand the question. I don't know if you do, Adam.
Is that how ketamine can help an opiate clog?
Yes, it is. So yeah, that's what it is.
So my guess is potentially a number of ways, and again, I think it would probably all depend on the dose you were taking. But if you think about it as a dissociative, both from emotional distress but also physical distress, the early kind of bits of an opiate clock, and I know there'll be people on this call who will, be able to talk about this better, but it is misery, achiness, lack of enjoyment, kind of just wiped out dreadful. But the kind of unspoken about parts of opiate withdrawal are the flooding of negative emotions and feeling really emotionally raw to things around you. And for a lot of people with PTSD, that can lead to a real resurgence of really harmful emotions. And ketamine actually is quite a useful emotional anesthetic as well as a physical anesthetic. And in terms of physical aches and pains, actually, ketamine at the right dose would probably reduce some of your discomfort. I'd be worried about it as a solo response because obviously, there's the risk of, significant diarrhea and vomiting, and I'd be worried about aspiration, people, being unable to move and therefore becoming dehydrated. But I think people are very innovative in using different sorts of drugs that may be available to ameliorate different sorts of symptoms. I don't think it's up there as the top 5 things most people clucking off heroin would go for. That would be an opiate, followed by pregav, followed by benzos, followed by spice, and I guess, maybe methadone or boop,
Noted, thank you. So I'll just ask one more question. And it's basically, what should we do now? If you were homesec or whatever, what do you think we should do?
That's a huge question. I go back to what I was saying previously about regulation of stimulants. Obviously, no one's ever going to make me a home secretary, but I think that the same thing would apply. And I know that there's a pharmacy model that's been kind of floated. Or a little plug for Steve Roll's How to Regulate Stimulants. It's a great report. So, yeah, I think that they would have to seek to regulate them in a not dissimilar way to how I think we should be regulating more traditional substances that are illegal to possess.
Okay, thank you, Karenza. Both Matt and Ali have said they would vote Karenza for Home Secretary. So, Adam, can you please earn my vote for you as Home Secretary, please?
Well, no, I wouldn't be running for Home Secretary because, there are some drugs I think are probably best not widely available for human consumption. Like, I really don't like synthetic cannabinoids, but I would The starting point is always to give honest, credible, transferable information that says this drug could be a bit risky. If you want to reduce your risks, this is how you do it. And yes, it could be quite nice, because by being honest and transparent about the risks of new drugs and old drugs, I think when a new drug does come kind of into play and a government goes, guys, we really are worried about this one, we think it's going to kill you, that's why we're going to ban it, I think lots of people will go, oh, thanks for that, you're kind of out there looking out for us. But you can only walk away with that positive view of a government regulation if the rest of their drug laws are sensible. And the idea that you are going to classify, and this is the biggest problem for the government actually, is that 11 of the top 15 illicit drugs used in the UK today are either medicines or prescription medicines within a very short space of time. Within the next 5 years, virtually all of the most commonly used illicit drugs will also be medicine. And then you have who's your dealer and why are you taking it? And it comes down to a moral judgment. And that's a bit nuts.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. So I think we can call it a day then. So thank you very, very much, most of all, Karenza and Adam. Many thanks, everyone, for joining. So yeah, look forward to hearing you soon.
Thank you for organising it, James.
Lovely weekend, everyone.
Lovely. Thanks, James.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.